Well, Derrick, thank you so much for helping with my project. First of all, could you talk a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I can just start with like basics about myself. So my name is Derrick Ray. Currently a college student. I study software engineering at Iowa State University. Um, I'm 23 years old. Come from a working class family in Clinton, Iowa. Um, African American. I don't know. That's pretty much it. I'm a relatively low key guy. Just kind of stick to myself and try to work on my school stuff. And yeah,
That's awesome. So how did you find out about my project?
I believe it was through Anna. I met her through a Discord support group for people with ADHD. And I think she had shared your post about it, and I was curious. So I'm pretty sure I was like, oh yeah, I'd like to do that because I like helping people with projects like that. I think um, I don't know. I'm one of those people. I don't know how you would describe it, but interesting or odd things are kind of like my guilty pleasure. I really like really interesting, unique projects. So I seen that and I was like, oh, I definitely have to help with that.
I really appreciate it because my original plan back in December when I started the project was, well, I should give you a little bit of background. I was working at home before everybody else was. So I've
Really?
been working at home for like the past 2 years. And I would find that I would stay at the house only seeing like family and people at home for like a week at a time. And I kind of created this project as a cure to social distancing because I wanted to do like interviews with like random strangers at like Starbucks and at the mall and on the street and what have you. But with the COVID lockdown, I had to move everything online, and it's been really difficult to sort of recreate that same situation. So I'm really glad you agreed to participate.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's pretty smart though.
Yeah, and it was really neat. From a personal development standpoint, just being able to feel comfortable walking up to people and striking up a conversation. Oftentimes, you don't have anything to talk about, but having a project like this sort of gives you an excuse, at least.
Right. That makes sense. And I can understand that. I'm not the most social person, but I did work in customer service, because coming from a working class family, didn't really have a lot of money. So I got a job as soon as I could. When I was 16, that's when I got my first cell phone. And, I call it customer service mode, or I'll be at the gas station. I'll just strike up a random conversation with, the clerk about just anything. So it's definitely important.
Yeah, and talking about being willing to support other people's projects, I've asked a lot of people like, "Hey, I'm doing this project. Can I interview you for a little bit?" And I don't know. Sometimes the pitch, that first few seconds comes off as being like scammy. Like, what are you selling me? Or what's the deal here? But most people, once you get kind of past that, uh, I've been really amazed to see how supportive they are to just help a random stranger with what they're working on. So that gives me a lot of hope for humanity.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because I was reading this like futurism Reddit last night, and I think people have a tendency to be like we evolved to cooperate, right? Because cooperation can lead to survival, but I also believe we evolved to like compete. Um, and a lot of people were saying like we can focus on which of those behaviors to focus on. So I'm hoping like as we evolve as a species, like we can do more of these things where we choose to focus on helping other people, even if we don't immediately understand them or, we can't immediately interact with them or see them, right? Because we evolved in these small tribes. So outside your immediate family or a few cousins, like I feel like people have a hard time. What's the word I'm looking for? Like visualizing them or justifying helping these people. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's interesting you talk about cooperation versus competition. I kind of struggle with that a lot myself. And I think sometimes competition can be good depending upon what the aim is of the people that are cooperating or
Right.
competing rather. Um, if you're a competition, if you're just competing to try to outdo your competition, that's your sole focus, then that leads to so many negative behaviors, about sabotaging and undermining. But like if your sort of reason you're competing is something that even if you lost at, but one of your competitors won, you still felt good about. I mean,
Yeah, I'd agree.
that's like the ideal competition. It's like, how do we get more of that? You know?
Yeah, I think um, a lot of people might look at that and be like, okay, well, competition is good. I'd agree with you, but then they get too focused on competing for the sake of competing, right? Like at the end of the day, whether or not you like someone, we're all here together, right? And so the ideal situation is like, I want my competitors to win as much as I want myself to win, right? Like, because if we, I don't know. That's the end of that tangent.
Well, I mean, you're in school right now, and that's sort of like the perfect case study, right? Because there's so much emphasis put on grades and class ranking, and at the end of the day, that really doesn't matter. It's about, knowledge and skill acquisition, growth, and like, you know, pushing the boundaries. But we get so caught up in sort of the mechanics of the class ranking and who's the best in the class. That's really kind of a silly question. The question is, what's everybody learning, and is it worthwhile, and is it making them grow? It's like,
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think because at my school, even if someone else gets a better grade than me, like we're still all under the same banner, right? Like we go to the same college, we're in the same class, we're in the same major, so I can see you and recognize you as like a brother or an ally, a sister, and I just hope that people can kind of expand that to see everyone that way, right? Like even if I may not agree with you on everything, you're still a human just like me, and I want you to succeed as much as I want to succeed.
yeah, I wish we could see more of that. Um, well, did you know that NASA is planning to send people to the moon in 2024?
I think I kind of keep up with that sort of stuff, so I think I've heard that. I don't know if I knew that particularly, like the exact details, but I know that they had plans to send people to the moon again at some point.
And what do you think about it?
I think it's a good idea. I was reading this Reddit thread, and so I don't know if you've ever heard of the Fermi Paradox.
Yes.
Someone had a really interesting proposition about that, and they said like the answer to the Fermi Paradox is that um, you have these creatures who evolve into intelligence before they can evolve restraint, and so they burn out their planet before they can learn to control um, that. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think pushing our species to get off the planet and expand, even just for the sake of exploration and pushing science to its boundaries, I think I always see as a good thing. And I'm very excited to see NASA taking these big steps again, because I think people see NASA as like um, almost this sort of like legacy um, institution instead of this like amazing boundary breaking group of scientists that I believe they are. And so it's nice to see them like step into this role again.
Yeah, and that's interesting about the Fermi paradox that maybe um, when when civilizations develop technology, they their technology outpaces their wisdom, sort of,
Yeah,
maybe.
that's basically the what I was getting at.
Yeah. Well, how do you see space exploration kind of helping prevent that for us?
I think the more the more planets we can reach and the more resources we can reach, the better, right? Like ideally, and I'm being a super futurist here. If we could get to the point where we could start utilizing the asteroids around us, that's big for us, right? Because there's so many resources just freely available out in space if we can get to them. Now, there's a whole nother conversation to get into about like who can utilize that and how do we utilize that. But I think just having access to those resources puts a lot less burden on the planet that we live on, right? Because right now it's like you're living on a sand castle and you're digging out the sand underneath of you to try and build on top, and eventually that's just going to collapse, right? So that's not ideal for anyone. So the sooner we can start utilizing resources outside the planet, I think the better, in whatever form that takes.
So you see sort of space mining and maybe even space manufacturing as being something that will happen someday?
Um, I think it's probably inevitable. It really just depends on how we as a species determine how and who can utilize those resources. Um, because I think right now no one can, right? I think there's some sort of agreement that like no one can stake a claim to those things, and I agree with that. I'd hate to see private interest monopolizing space. I think those sort of resources should be shared for the good of all. But I think if we can get to that point where we're out there, then yeah, I would see it as inevitable. Like if you're living in the forest and there's a nearby tree and you want to build a log cabin, you're probably going to cut down the tree. Um, so I would say yeah. Long answer.
So, about not being able to own it, but being able to use it, you're right. There's the outer space treaty that says that no country can claim any off-world body as its own. Um, and people have sort of likened this to sort of the way the oceans are controlled. Like nobody can claim like the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, there's a certain like zone of control and influence out from the shores, but like the ocean itself is sort of like a commons area. But people can fish inside of those commons, and the fish they take aboard their boat become the property of whoever caught them. And that same sort of theory is sort of being applied to the extraction of resources in space, that nobody can own the moon, but you could extract resources from the moon, and once you've like sort of brought it onto your own ship, now they're yours. And I was wondering, do you think this makes sense, or does that cause you some concern, or what do you think about it?
That causes me concern. As much as I'm for, and I know this is a contradictory position, but as much as I'm for utilizing resources outside of our planet, I'd like them to be very far outside of our planet, right? Like, I don't want, personally, I don't want people mining from the moon or anything like that. I think people use these sort of loopholes, right, for personal gain, and I think this comes back to cooperation versus competition, right? Because from a competitive standpoint, being able to utilize these loopholes and gain an advantage in business or personal equity or whatever is good for you, but it's bad for everyone else. I think when we go to do these things, we should stop and ask ourselves, like, what is the immediate benefit versus the long term benefit, right? With the Earth is much more massive than the moon, and so you can mine out of the moon as much as you want, but eventually, there might not be much left. And so to answer your question, I say, on one hand, I'm for it, but I think that's going to really require some like sort of philosophical, um, what's the word I want to say? It's going to require some questions to be answered from everyone, is like, where do we draw the boundary? Like, is it okay for people to take from these things? Like, should we consider it like a natural, almost kind of like a nature park, like uh like Yellowstone? I don't know. It does bother me. I think off the top of my head, I would say I would hope that people wouldn't take it too far, but uh, I'm not exactly holding my breath about it.
Now, what do you think about people fishing in the ocean, which doesn't like belong to a country, and that fish becoming part of, owned by them? Would you also have some concerns with that, or do you see something fundamentally different between, say, mining the moon and fishing in the ocean?
I think that's a good question, and I'd say it's pretty complicated. Just depends. I think you can fish from the ocean, and you could consider that like a renewable resource, depending on how much and to what extent, what scale someone's fishing. Right, like if it's just a one off for someone, um, then maybe it's not so bad. But I think if it's like a large scale company and they're fishing on a huge scale, then maybe I would consider that a problem. I think, like, and if maybe to answer your question and make an analogy, like if it's like a small scale for a person mining like out on the moon or something, maybe I wouldn't have as much as a problem with it. But like I think once it surpasses a certain level, then I might see that as a problem, because then I would recognize the potential that has for long term devastation, right?
Yeah, it's sort of what you're saying is you need like a harbor master, somebody that says you can fish, but this is your quota, and they kind of enforce the rules to make sure that you don't destroy it for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's fair, because yeah, we all share this area, so we don't want anyone going too far, just because you go too far and then there's nothing left for anyone.
And earlier you were talking about you think we need to make use of space resources, but you also talked through some of the complications, concerns with making use of those space resources. I was wondering if maybe you could walk me through um, how to make which resources you think would be acceptable to use, and sort of, kind of how you see that unfolding in a way that would work for you.
I think resources that are acceptable to use outside of our planet would be pretty much off the top of my head just asteroids. I think like um, Kuiper Belt and on. Well, no, I think that's actually pretty far out, but um, I think asteroids are fine. I think there's a lot of them, and I think they pose a hazard to space travel in general. So even if we got them out of the way, I don't necessarily see that as a problem. And can you reiterate the second part of your question for me? Sorry.
Oh, how do you, what's the pathway to actually making use of space resources that you see being most acceptable to your views?
Um, I think the most acceptable way to do that is, one, we got to get to the point where we can get out there and have a viable form of space travel, right? Like, I think we're getting there, but what we have right now is probably pretty far from what we need to have. Um, and as far as like what's acceptable, I think your analogy earlier of like a harbor master is pretty good, right? Like we let companies go out there, we let people go out there, and we say, okay, like you can do this, but no more than that, right? Just so we know how much of what each person is using, and we as a society can draw the line, right? Like what's too much, what's going too far, and then from there we can say, okay, like what are the impacts of doing this and this, right? Because if someone goes out there and starts mining but then creates a bunch of hazardous space debris, that's a problem for everyone else. Then maybe we don't want them doing that. Or if getting rid of mining up all these asteroids creates a big problem down the road, maybe we want to not consider doing that. So I'm all for utilizing those resources, but I want to try and approach it in a way that like is measured and at least considers the impacts of doing so, right? Like I don't want to just go out there and start mining left and right and having a good time and like space capitalism or whatever. But I think getting out there and using those resources might alleviate the burden that we're putting on our planet now, if that answers your question.
No, absolutely. And there's two well-known billionaires that are really into space right now, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. I was wondering if you're familiar with either one of their space plans and kind of goals.
I'm familiar with Elon Musk for the most part. Bezos is a little more low key. I know he's working on some stuff with Blue Dream, but I'm not quite sure where he's at with that. I think he has a contract with NASA, but other than that, no. I know Elon has plans to get to Mars soon, and he's been working on Starlink. I've been reading some stuff about Starlink recently, which is pretty interesting, and I have different concerns about that. But for their long term plans, I don't know. All I know is that I know Musk wants to get to Mars, so that's. But Bezos he's a little more hard to read on his long term ambitions for space travel, I think.
Yeah, I mean, talking about Starlink, there's actually a launch of 60 Starlink satellites this morning, in fact. Seems to be coming about twice a month right now.
Yeah, I've seen that. I think it's pretty cool. I just hope they take the advice of. I was reading some stuff about some astronomers had some concerns about the the satellites obscuring the view, um, like out into space. But from what I understand, they have been taking some suggestions on that. So I have hope for it. But off the top of my head, I think it's a good thing. I think having like large scale internet access for everyone is good, especially these like smaller, more disenfranchised communities, right? Like different indigenous groups and stuff, because the sooner they can get their knowledge out into the world, I think the better, right? I think that sort of knowledge is something that we want to keep.
And then also just in terms of opportunity, I mean, the other day I had a graphic designer in, I think, Ghana, create like a little logo for my countdown to the moon thing. And, it's like pretty amazing uh, how much work you could do online and in terms of like programming and, you know, uh, media editing and writing and all sorts of things that just having access to the internet suddenly makes available to you.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree. And I this may be a controversial opinion, but I really do believe that we're rapidly approaching the point where internet access should be like a basic right for everyone, right? Because as someone who does programming daily, I mean, I couldn't do half the stuff I do without access to the internet. Like, it's like having a car with gas versus without gas. And I think everyone who wants it should have access to that sort of information, just because it seems so vital. Like I couldn't even imagine my life without access to the internet. And I think we're reaching the point where everything's moving online. School, finances. I mean, any sort of information sharing finds its way online eventually.
And from my standpoint, I found it a little bit overwhelming, the amount of activity that's happening online and the amount of resources. I'm also into computer science, and it's just like the number of projects and libraries and articles. It's like on one hand you want to read them all, and on the other hand it's just like so time consuming. How do you manage that?
It is. I would agree with you. It is very overwhelming. It's like I liken what we're turning into almost to like a colony of ants, right? Like I feel like as more people become super or connected to the internet, it's like we change into this super organism, right? Where it's like this is the collective experience of all of mankind. And now for your question is how do I deal with it? I guess I just apply a filter, really, like what am I doing, right? I have ADHD, so most of my life has been dealing with overstimulation. And the key for me and to manage my ADHD is to have just enough stimulation, but also to focus on what I need to do. And trust me, I'm always online. I'm like, I read so many different articles every day, and I'm always seeing what new projects people are up to. And it's just so fascinating to me to like see like the collective knowledge and experience of humanity grow. But at the same time, I really do have to focus on like, okay, like today I'm doing homework. I got to focus on doing this, and this. And so I kind of just you can train yourself to shut out what is too much, right? Because having ADHD, I always want to like do more. I always want to do more, and so another part is developing this restraint to like know like, you know, I could read 10 articles about the newest EVs coming out, but maybe I shouldn't do that right now. Um, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, have you read that book or maybe listened to it? Algorithms to Live By?
No, I haven't actually. What? Tell me about it. It sounds interesting.
Yeah, so it takes like regular computer algorithms and applies them to everyday life. Like for example, let's say you're looking for an apartment in San Francisco, and you know that each apartment you see, because the market's like so hot, either you have to make a decision to buy it right then, or somebody else is going to get it. And so the question is, how many apartments should you go and look at in order to you know create a baseline that as soon as something equals or exceeds, you would know that that's a good thing for you. And so it kind of walks through that. But another one's like the whole, I think it's explore versus exploit. Um, what's the, um, in terms of like looking at a new restaurants to go and eat at versus going to a place that you're already familiar with and you're going to enjoy, but you might be missing out on something that's even better. But at the same token, the place that you don't know might actually be far worse. So it's just how do you work through that decision? So it kind of works through relevant computer algorithms and applies it to like these everyday life situations. I found the book to be kind of enjoyable.
That's pretty interesting. I think I'm gonna check that out because, you know, I do have those sort of problems sometimes. Um, I think that's interesting and definitely applies to like what we're talking about. Did they ever really like give an answer like, or is it really just subjective?
They give specific mathematically backed up answers. Like
Really?
in the case of the apartment, I think it was like you set a baseline in terms of how long you're going to be looking at apartments, and then basically for I believe it's the first 1/3 time you're just working on setting that baseline, and then the second 2/3, anything that equals or meets that baseline, that's the one to get. And then they show you, kind of like using statistical modeling how, in like 95% of the times, that will let you get to the best thing. I mean, sometimes the absolute best is in that 1/3, and then you're kind of messed up. But often, most of the time, that the absolute best is somewhere in that other 2/3, and there's always usually some really good options in that other 2/3 too. But that was kind of the answer there. I don't remember the answers for the restaurant one. Um, I, yeah, but
That's fine. That's really interesting though. I think that makes sense, and maybe I definitely will check out that book because I think I could use as much help as possible when it comes to planning things like that.
yeah, and it's really interesting taking like network issues. Yeah, I mean, oftentimes you have computers on Ethernet network, and only one of them could be talking at a time. And so they have like a random kind of a generator that says when they can talk. So they're listening, it's like silent, but then they like talk, but then another computer talks exactly at the same time. And then it's like, when should you try to talk again on the network? The whole exponential back off type of algorithm for that. So it's a really good book. As a computer science person, I think you'd enjoy it.
Oh yeah, I definitely and I was listening to you talk. That's pretty interesting. So I think I will check it out. But if I may, as someone who's a little younger, like I don't know how old you are, but people consider me to be Gen Z. At least according to the Pew Research Center, Gen Z's cutoff is 1997, which is when I was born. Um, and so I think like as people as this internet technology evolves and becomes more part of our lives, and as younger generations get access to the internet, I think they become more adept at navigating these at all this stimulation, right? And so I think that gives me hope that like as people become more saturated in this and more accustomed to it, they become better at navigating and utilizing it, all that information. But then I also worry about like, are there potential trade-offs from doing so, right? Like, because our brains didn't really evolve for this sort of like super stimulation, and so maybe over time that'll go away. But like I imagine there will be trade-offs going forward. What do you think about that?
No, absolutely. And it's like the hand shapes the tool, but after frequent use, the tool begins to shape the hand too. And I worry about this in application of the computer and our minds. Um, on and it's not just an accidental type thing. I mean, there are people researching how to make the computer more addictive, how to capture your attention, how to sort of pull you in. I mean, an entire industry of marketing and you know uh, political science and business people that are 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 there nothing but to try to hijack our attention. And they have the tools available to monitor us and to do experiments on us in mass, um, that I I kind of worry about trying to find some way to protect ourselves against, and that's sort of my my fear.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I share the same concerns, and I think the only way, really, at least that I'm aware of, to combat that is really the same sort of medium that puts us in jeopardy to begin with. Is people just really, it's on people, I think, to educate themselves, and for people like us who know, to try and help advocate for that sort of like, hey guys, you need to be aware of what these people are doing to you, right? Because even if I shout into the void for 100 years and I tell people like, hey, these people, they're watching you, they have access to your data, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to remain blissfully ignorant to that, like, I can't do anything for that. So I think there's a small degree of self accountability. Like, you yourself should also seek to protect yourself. I think I was reading this article, and someone said that you should treat intellectual, or no, they said you should treat data like intellectual property. They had advocated for, like, instead of these companies like Google, Facebook, etc., having access to your data like that, you should be in a position where you could willingly trade that away, right? Like, people's data should be considered their personal property, and I think to that extent, I would hope to see one day something like that, where like that sort of data is like a legally protected right for people, right? Like, you shouldn't just, I don't think you should just have access to that stuff as a company, even if you are providing that service, at least without their consent, like their willing consent, not hidden behind a bunch of legal jargon, right? Like, people say, okay, you can have access to my data, that's fine. And so I think that's my answer. On one part, educate yourself and um, seek to protect yourself against that. But on the other hand, maybe we can take some legal actions and say, well, each person has sovereign right to their own data they generate. Right, that's their intellectual property, and we try to ban companies from just harvesting that, at abandon.
Yeah, and I think Europe is sort of leading the way on thinking through these issues. They have, what is it, GDPC, GDRP, or something like that, some type of global standard that basically says, your data does belong to you. You have the right to demand people to delete it and be notified on how it's going to be used, and about not using personal identifying information for various types of analysis and things like that. So I think there's a little hope.
Yeah, fingers crossed. I think as I get older and as I get more into like the sort of computer science tech sphere, I hope to help push for stuff like that. Just because I think it's really important, especially for people who don't know, right? Like we know, right? Because that's stuff we deal with every day. But there's a lot of people, mom and pop, who are blissfully unaware of the ways they're being taken advantage of. So fingers crossed. I do hope that going forward and as we embrace this sort of internet information era, we can get things like that. I think having that sort of framework is paramount. I think people definitely have a right to be like, no, that's my information and I can decide who gets to use it.
Yeah, and a lot of it's a matter of trust. I mean, my mom got a call from somebody that said they were from Microsoft and they wanted to fix a issue on her computer. Could she just go to this URL and install this application? You know, my mom took that as being, wow, Microsoft is really interested in me and so nice of them to reach out. It's just like, but it's a scam. They're gonna hijack your computer. They're trying to get you to install some malware.
I
It's
think
just.
that's happened to my grandma as well.
And then on the other side about it, I was interviewing somebody yesterday for this project who was talking about going scuba diving at this like a little fishing village in Mexico, and she was saying that everybody left their doors unlocked. Nobody was afraid of people stealing things. It's just like uh, it's difficult always having to be on your guard. Um, it's kind of. I mean, I was talking about like. Kind of a semi-related issue of always having to be on your guard. I was looking on Twitter. A lady was kind of talking about how people are saying they need to take personal defense classes. And she's like, "Great! So in addition of everything else I had to do, I had to become a martial artist just to stay alive." It's just like,
Yeah, I think that's kind of sad. Um, Sorry, did you have anything else to say?
no, no. It's just the state of humanity and how it it like creating that safe space for us to live in. It seems so difficult.
Yeah, if I could, I think this is a good time to draw a parallel to what we were talking about earlier, and that too much competition for the sake of purely competing is bad. I think we create this atmosphere in which I mean, some of it is not quite so black and white. Like having to protect yourself against people isn't necessarily competition, but being on your guard all the time, right? I think you can draw parallels to this sort of like we're competing against each other constantly to survive in one form or another, right? And I think there's a direct one-to-one with crime and with the sort of opportunity to access that people have in their area. And of course, there are always exceptions to that. Like some people are just they simply are like that, and you can't prevent every crime. But I do believe that like when we cooperate more and compete less, at least to a degree, and more people have opportunity to sort of access, their need to commit crime goes down, right? You don't see a bunch of crimes in the richest neighborhoods. You don't see people breaking into houses left and right there because, those towns, those areas, they have those. They don't need that. Where you go to more impoverished areas with less access to those things, and crime is happens all the time. And I don't believe that's just a coincidence. And so, I think I have a hope that as we continue to progress, like we can recognize this and start competing with each other less, right? I hope that something like climate change can help unite us against like a common enemy, right? Because I think without a common enemy, we just have constant um, infighting and competing, and it fosters this sort of environment where it's just a dog against dog. Everyone's competing against each other. It's like we're living in a modern jungle, right? Like we have all these fancy tools, but at the end, it's just a bunch of animals competing against each other for the limited resources they have. And I hope we can look at that and kind of take a step beyond that eventually.
Yeah, It's difficult to see how that might happen. I, one other kind of group that I've been trying to reach out to as part of this project is intentional communities. Um, Basically, groups of people that instead of just living in random houses next to each other, actually have decided to form kind of like a deeper community. And you see all sorts of different ranges of this, from like communal living to like eco villages to um, you know uh, things that are set up around religious type of things, and other standards. I was wondering what your thought, or if you had any familiarity with like these intentional communities, and if you had any thoughts on that.
I do have some familiarity with it. The only forms I really know are like communes and like those sort of religious groups that go and live off together. I think it's an interesting concept. It seems like a very good and sustainable approach to um, living, but on one hand, I kind of just see it as like, um, how do I want to phrase this? Natural human tendency and like this sort of desire to um, break away from, right? Like you have these people who become accumulated to are accustomed to modern life, my bad, and they get tired of it and they want to break away. I can respect that. I think everyone should be able to do that if they want to. Um, I don't know if I ever see modern cities going away. I'd like to see us I'd like to see people develop that same sort of spirituality towards their community, right? I envy those people because they have this spiritual depth, like they see each other in a much positive way, like that environment I would think I'd imagine to be better, right? Like unless it's like a super hostile religious cult, like you go to those places because you feel a sense of community with these people, right? And you want to live next to them and you see them as brothers, sisters, neighbors, friends, whatever. And I just see I look at that and I see a parallel to like modern cities and towns, and it's just like, maybe you feel that way for your neighbor, but beyond that, my neighbor 10 blocks down the street, do I feel the same way about them? No. And so I don't know if that answers your question. I see that they possess this sort of spirituality to them, like a spiritual richness that I would hope that we could replicate on a larger scale one day. But I think once you surpass a certain size, our brains just aren't evolved to do that, right? We're used to living in small tribes. Our brains evolved when we were living in small groups and small tribes, and so some people maybe they want that spiritual richness back, and so they seek to replicate those sort of early conditions. Um, yeah, that's my take on it.
Well, and I wonder, on Earth, um, the Earth really has shrunk. I mean, you could literally get, well, before the pandemic, pretty much between any two places on the Earth within 24 hours.
Oh yeah,
And we're all within maybe 1 second light distance from each other. I mean, we could have like real-time conversations between any two points on the globe, pretty much. Um, and so even if you set up like kind of like your own little community here on Earth, you're sort of it's sort of there's not much of a barrier between that community and the society at large.
right. It's really more symbolic at this point.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering if, as we have groups of humans that go and live on the moon, go and live on Mars, go and live in other places in the solar system, if there's some like real value to that physical separation, and kind of like being able to literally get away from it all.
I think that's a really interesting question. Disclaimer: I think it's purely subjective, right? Like it and philosophical. I think it really just depends on a number of things at that time. Like one, the state of culture of our society at that point. Also our technology, and yeah, I think the internet's a great thing because we're culturally evolving at a much more rapid pace than in the past. And so I have hope for things like that. But I don't know. Maybe there is. I think it just depends on also who has access to those things. Like I imagine the first people going to Mars are either going to be scientists or very wealthy people. First people going to the moon, scientists or wealthy people. But if those things eventually become open to people, um, I would just hope that it wouldn't foster this sort of separatist mentality. I really think that this is the time when we need to come together just as a species and stop viewing each other as an enemy. So I don't know. I hope that I would just hope that wouldn't happen, right? Like, I mean, I'm all for like wanting to go somewhere else and get away from it. I think that's healthy. Everyone needs a vacation. So it would also depend on how it's used, but I think yeah, it just depends on how it's used. I would hope people would use it as a way to purely take a break instead of a way to separate. Because I think when people start making separate groups, separate tribes, then that becomes a problem.
Yeah, I don't know if you've read, let's see, War of the Worlds, by H.G. Wells.
I've heard of it, and I've read up on the very famous radio broadcast quite a few times.
I've often thought, you know, Elon Musk or somebody like him is able to create that self-sustaining city and on Mars, and then technology, we enter dark ages here on Earth, and that city is cut off, but continues to expand and grows on its own. I could just see at some point those people looking at Earth going, "Man, that's the garden spot. We should have that for ourselves." And so those Martians are really this alternate version of ourselves that have gone over there.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that. I'm gonna proposition an alternative book, actually two books. There's Red Mars, and then
Hmm.
there's also Conquering Mars, I believe, is the book. I think it was Ray Bradbury. Um, and uh, Conquering Mars went something like when they went to Mars and conquered Mars, Mars had also conquered them. It was kind of like a Twilight Zone kind of thing. So maybe that doesn't apply as much here, but definitely more so with Red Mars, where you have these early group of scientists go to Mars to colonize the planet, and then as their children and their children's children's um, propagated and began to live on this planet, they really did develop this sort of like mentality where they were really close to the planet. And I'm envious of that. Now, if I could be a bit of a skeptic here, I hope that in the future someone could look at Earth and be like, "Wow, that's still a garden." You know, fingers crossed for that. But
As opposed to who would want that dump?
right, yeah, that's what I'm worried about. Like, oh, Earth, we don't go there. But I think it's interesting. I think it depends on how long people live there, right? I think I was watching a video the other day about how we would eventually evolve to be different because of the different gravities on planets, right? So if you had generations and generations of people living on these planets, eventually they would evolve to be slightly different. But I mean, that's like thousands of years, right? So um, I think it depends again on what our culture is like at that point. Um, I think we need to take a step back and redefine what it's like to be, what it means to be human, right? Like what does it mean to be a human being, and maybe take a step back from like what we look like, what we sound like, rather like what is inside our heads, like what is our ancestral heritage. Because I think if we don't and we reach that point, you may very well have that problem.
Yeah, whenever humanity sees itself as being distinct, where you really do have Earthlings, lunatics, and Martians. Mm. Uh, yeah. So if you were to look out 500 years, which is about the same amount of time as from now to the time that Christopher Columbus came to North America, what do you think humanity will look like? Or even as opposed to trying to predict what humanity would look like, how about what would you want humanity to look like?
Okay, so first part. If I look out 500 years from now, um, as with most of my answers, it really depends. Um, the growth rate of our technology rap is exponentially increasing. So, it's hard for me to make a prediction. But if I'm being an optimist here, right? So I'm gonna give two answers for this first part. One second, I'm gonna drink some water. So if I'm being an optimist, I say on the good end, we're definitely firmly a type 1 civilization now, and we've managed to get climate change under control, and we've moved beyond our planet. We're taking advantage of resources out in space rather than on the planets we live on, and that sort of system is being regulated, and hopefully, you know, poverty has gone down, disease has gone down. People don't really have these sort of basic wants anymore. I'd like to see us get to a point where we can live more in harmony with a planet rather than at the expense of a planet. Um, and I'd like to get to the point where we no longer really toil for these basic things, right? Like where every human is really free to explore their desires, their talents, what they're interested in. Like you have a lot of people, a lot of potential scientists and brilliant engineers and doctors toiling day after day on the farm because they don't have access to those things. Not that that sort of work is lesser than, but if they were in a position where they didn't have to do that, they could potentially dedicate their lives to something else and become very great at it. And so I'd like to see us get to a point where people can choose to do the thing or not to. If they want to pursue a life that they're happy with, and if they want to, become some great painter or whatever, that they're free to do that. I'd also hope that at that point, if we do get to the point where we are developing AI and robots, things like that nature, I would hope that we could really define what it means to be human and avoid the matrix, avoid iRobot, avoid all those negative robot movies where we enslave robots and we treat them like they're lesser than us. Maybe I'm kind of a radical with this, but I think if something can develop a sentience, especially if it's something we create, I think we should give it a sort of respect. Now, if I'm being negative, I would hope that we could at least get off the planet before we push it to the point where we can't sustain it any longer. I think humanity will always exist in some form, um, but I would hope that it wouldn't be at the expense of everything on the planet, right? Like, I would hate to see for the entire biosphere to just collapse because we waited too long to try and save it. Um, and then, what was the second part of your question? I'm sorry.
That was pretty much it. What would you hope it would be, and then what do you think it'd be? So,
Yeah, I would hope it would be something good where we've really met our potential and recognized our flaws and earnestly seek to fix them. I know we'll never be perfect as a species because nothing's ever perfect, but I think if we can earnestly seek to better ourselves, then we'll be all right. And I think where we will be, maybe some sort of middle ground where things are better, but we still have progress to make. I think that's a realistic, you know, expectation. If I'm being an optimist again.
and if it were safe and affordable, would you have an interest in going into space?
Oh, absolutely. I'm always sad that I wasn't born in the era of space travel, but I was born just in time to make memes about it. So
There's a a reality TV show that's in the works. That's going to be a global contest to find a person to send to the International Space Station for 10 days.
Ooh,
Is that something you would be interested in?
that would be cool. I mean, of course, that's like a once in a lifetime experience. Who wouldn't? Who wouldn't? I think just to be able to say like, "Oh yeah, I won that," and then I was tell your kids or your friends or whatever. Like, I think yeah, that'd definitely be really cool. So, congratulations to whoever wins, like in the future.
Well, actually, my ambitions are a little bit lower. I would love just to be a part of it. I just think that'd be kind of cool. Like just be a contestant or a. Um, I think it'd be neat. It's so funny. The conversation changes so much. It's like, what do you think about us sending people to the moon in 2024? Oh, that's a horrible idea. We should be spending our money to save this or do that. What do you think about you going to space? Now, that's an interesting idea. Let's do that. you know.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely pretty funny. I think I don't know. I think both are equally important, right? Like,
I know. But the funny thing is I think we as individuals really judge everything by the impact it has on ourselves. And sending like professional astronauts off to the moon to go and do research and stuff, it's like, how do you really connect that to our individual lives? And it's really difficult, I mean, for the person working at Starbucks or the guy that's working at a cubicle at a big corporation or what have you. I mean, uh, it's really hard to make that connection. But if you're able to send everyday people, even if you don't get to go, at least in the back of your mind, you're like, I could go. Like
yeah,
there's a possibility, and I think
I
that
think
makes a
that's interesting.
I think that makes a big difference.
I think that's interesting. And now that you say that, I kind of support it even more because I think getting that notion into people's minds is important, right? Because we're not a type 1 civilization yet. Like space travel is really more of a luxury for very few or something we're working on. But if people start to see that as something that could potentially happen, then maybe it becomes more relevant to them. And maybe then we start making more progress on that front. So I think it's a good idea. I think that sort of public participation, making it relevant to them, is probably a very important step in the process of finally getting there.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, have you ever heard of the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program?
I think so. Isn't that something like didn't NASA partner with SpaceX on that or something? Or maybe that's they had partnered with Blue Moon. I don't know. I think I've heard of it.
Yeah, so there's sort of like two programs that have been in the news. The Human Landing System is the one about trying to actually get the astronauts from the orbit of the moon to the moon surface. But there's another program where NASA has all these instruments and scientific equipment and stuff they want to get to the moon. And used to they would build a rocket, build a lander, put on the moon. But a couple of years ago, they decided to take a different approach. They said, really the goal is to just get our equipment to the moon, not how it gets there. Maybe we should let other people figure that out. So they started this program where they let a number of companies compete, and they currently have 14 private companies that will bid on 2 contracts a year to actually take science equipment to the moon for NASA. And these companies are responsible for finding the launch provider, creating the lander, and delivering the NASA payload safely. But the only requirement is that they get the NASA payload to the moon. Everything else is completely in their control. So they have like other capacity on their lander. They could do whatever they want to with that, um, be it use it for a university or a private group or whatever you. Anyway, next year, Astrobotic in Pittsburgh is going to be the first company to actually land payloads as part of this program for NASA. And they're doing a special deal with DHL, the package delivery firm, where for like $450, you could send like a micro SD card sized object to the moon. And I've gone ahead and bought that. And I'm putting this recording on that micro SD card. So next summer, whenever it lands on the moon, you'll be part of this time capsule that maybe some future generation will come and uncover.
I think that's really interesting. I love the idea of like creating a history that people can one day discover, especially like in digital form. Can you imagine in at some point in the future when they're coming back and finding this and they're like, "Oh, what's this?" And then they look back and they're like, "Wow, this is so vintage." Like, what would we be at that point? So I think that's really awesome.
I know. Of course, I hope it's not like me with like a DVD player. I have some DVDs, but I don't have a player. I just see them going micro SD. I don't think we'll ever be able to get a reader for this.
You know what? That's probably true. I mean, like it just depends on how far into the future you're projecting someone might find this, right? Like I don't know how you feel about BCIs, but if those have their way, then it's like all sort of digital mediums would just become obsolete, right? Because then you just wouldn't even need anything, right? I don't know. I'd imagine it would be. It'd be like an SD card. What's that? What do you mean this was made 400 years ago?
they're, they're like they're like looking at the label, and it's like some micro SD card provider, and they're wondering why was it so important to get that label to the moon. There must be some special like
Yeah.
uh, I'm trying to think of a micro SD card. I guess SanDisk would be one. They're like, oh, SanDisk must have been like a god to them.
Yeah. Oh, have you ever seen Futurama?
Oh, I think I've seen an episode or two. I'm not sure.
There's this. I bring it up because there's this joke they have. It's a recurring joke in the show where it's the year 3000, but they're looking back on the 21st century and making like the same sort of like interpretations that we make of the past today, and it's just really funny how like vastly they misinterpret the society. So I'd imagine it'd be something of the same scale where they're like, maybe this was a god. Like this must have been the most important thing to them, or I don't know.
Yeah, like Coke, it's on everything. You know, the or Pepsi, or they're like there were two competing religions in the 1980s, Coke and Pepsi.
Oh
Um,
man.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's
see now that's a future that's a book I'd love to read. Can you imagine like future kids they're reading this like, oh my god, this is so boring. But then I'd read it and be like, this is the most hilarious thing I've ever read.
I know. I bet you could take people from any time in the past and let them read our history about them, and they'd be like, "Oh my God, they got it so wrong. Like it was so not that way."
I know. That's why I firmly hope we get to the point where like time travel is possible one day. Is I would like a proper account of what has happened in the past. You know, just to really know.
Indeed. Well, in a way, your time capsule helps to provide that for future generations.
Yeah, I'm definitely excited to be a part of it.
Well, Derrick, it was really a pleasure to get to talk to you. And is there anything else you wanted to talk about before we wrap it up?
No, I think I kind of got everything I wanted to say out. My last thing I'd like to say is I, I'm somewhere between an optimist and a realist, not a pessimist, an optimist and a realist. So I just hope that there will be people to find this in the future, and I hope that when we get if at that point that they're at, whoever finds I just hope that we're doing okay. Maybe we won't achieve all of our aspirations, and maybe life won't be as fancy and futuristic. Like I know back in the 80s or something, they were thinking we'd have flying cars and stuff by now, but I just hope we're doing all right at that point. I hope humanity's still kicking and we're making progress and we're living good lives. I don't know. That's really all I could ever hope for.
Those are good hopes. I share them too. Well, thank you so much, Derrick, and you have a good rest of your day, and hopefully we'll cross paths again.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. It was definitely a cool experience, and uh, I hope like going forward, your project, like when you complete it, I hope people find this and they really appreciate the work you've put in one day.
Well, at the very least, I know it's been a positive impact on me, so I can't complain. regardless. Yeah.
Well, you have a good day.
You too. Okay. Bye bye.
Bye bye.